The President of the European Commission has come to the conclusion that there's unlikely to be much more than some sort of framework agreement thrashed out at the UN Climate Change Conference, which happens in Copenhagen in less than a month's time. Who cares, you might say, if it was just some run-of-the-mill international conference. But we're told that without a detailed agreement, the planet's doomed. The nation which pumps out most greenhouse gases per head is the United States, yet in Washington, legislation to rein things in continues at near glacial pace, and we don't even know whether President Obama will bother to turn up in Copenhagen. Step forward Al Gore, the man who won a Nobel Prize for his activism on the subject. Before we talk to him, our culture correspondent Stephen Smith has this.
The falling leaves drift by the window, the autumn leaves of red and gold.
If the turn of the seasons leaves you more than normally rueful these days, the man to thank may very well be a former housemate of the actor Tommy Lee Jones. That's right, Al Gore, the one-time vice president. Now a Nobel Peace Prize winner, he's making sure we all know the bad news about climate change, in order, he says, that we can join forces to do something about it. Once upon a time, it seemed Gore would be remembered, if at all, as the man who spent 8 years at the White House watching through knitted fingers to see what Bill Clinton would get up to next. In those days, his environmental record wasn't perfect, say some.
When he was in office, it wasn't his fault, but he effectively sabotaged the Kyoto Protocol and ensured that the world did not have an effective instrument for tackling climate change. Now, this is because the US Senate had already decided 95-0 that there wouldn't be a strong treaty that the US would sign up to, but it was Gore's job to ensure, really, that that was the case.
The next president of these United States, Mr. Al Gore!
Up to a point. Gore finally got his crack at the top job 9 years ago this month, but lost out narrowly and controversially to George W. Bush.
I am Al Gore. I used to be the next president of the United States of America. I don't find that particularly funny.
Still, he's had the last laugh. His film about global warming, An Inconvenient Truth, won a brace of Oscars.
I think he's been an exemplary campaigner. His film was a fantastic film, highly successful. He's managed to wake a lot of people up to the threat of climate change. And most importantly, he's put a great deal of pressure on governments and on decision makers to do something about it.
As in so much else, Al Gore is a role model to politicians in the autumn of public life. The latest figure reborn as a freelance eco-warrior is our own John Prescott.
Well, earlier I asked Al Gore whether it would be enough, as has been suggested by the President of the European Commission, if the UN Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen produced only a framework agreement and not a binding treaty.
Well, it can give us a good start, and there is history for such an approach. When the first crisis of the global atmosphere occurred in the late 80s, the hole in the ozone layer, the treaty that was written in response was criticized as being too little and not enough to respond to the science. But only 3 years later, Margaret Thatcher gathered all the nations of the world in London, and that treaty was greatly toughened. The fact that a framework had been established, rules of the road written, a new course charted, made all the difference. And that can be a very powerful outcome of the Copenhagen conference.
President Obama has to be there, doesn't he?
Well, I hope he will go, and I know that Gordon Brown is going, some other heads of state are going. I was just about to say that I wanted to compliment Prime Minister Brown for his outstanding leadership on this issue, and make note of the fact that you in the United Kingdom have the luxury of both of your major political parties committed on this issue. I wish that were the case here in the United States, but there are positive signs of growing Republican support here in the United States that will enhance the chance of legislation passing before Copenhagen, and that in turn will improve the prospects of a strong framework agreement.
As you know, the European position is an 80% cut in carbon emissions by 2050. Is that the sort of cut that the United States needs to make as well?
Well, we have committed to such a cap, but people rightly point out that it's all too easy to set such goals that are so distant that the present generation of politicians will never be held to account for meeting them or failing to meet them. They are important. They can affect the forward planning of businesses and communities and nations, but the short-term and mid-term goals are even more important because we don't have the luxury of a lot of time to start cutting global warming pollution. We're putting 90 million tons of it every day into the thin shell of atmosphere surrounding our planet, and the scientific community has warned us we must stop that.
Are you depressed that the political system in your country doesn't seem capable of engaging with a problem of this magnitude?
Well, I'm not depressed about it. I'm motivated to change it, and in my book, Our Choice, I devote a whole chapter to the politics of climate and another whole chapter to the psychology and neuroscience, which is actually quite fascinating in its exploration of exactly what it is that we need to do to set these long-term goals based on our values. We have that capacity. We're predisposed to short-term thinking because our ancestors survived challenges that we are prone to immediately respond to, and yet we also have the capability to form values based on self-interest and our duty to the next generation, and then stick to them. The great cathedrals were built by multiple generations, staying on task for many decades. We now have to build a kind of metaphorical green cathedral that will safeguard the future for our children and grandchildren.
You do suggest in your book that we needn't have a catastrophe, that there are solutions, and that many of those solutions are technological. Do those technological solutions include nuclear?
I think nuclear will play a somewhat larger role, but not a much larger role. There are multiple problems. I'll only mention two and assume that the others can be solved. But the connection between nuclear reactors and the risk of weapons proliferation is something I've seen firsthand. For the 8 years I was in the White House, every nuclear weapons proliferation challenge was connected to a reactor program because the new technologies for enriching nuclear material shorten the distance from fuel to weapons-grade material. We're seeing that in Iran and North Korea now, so that limits the scalability globally. But the serious problem in developed countries is cost. There's not a single engineering firm in the West that I know of that will stand by a projection of how long it will take to build a plant or how much it will cost. The cost has been accelerating at 15% per year for quite a long time now, and that's dampened the enthusiasm, not least because the present generation of reactors only come in one size, extra large. Nevertheless, they will play some role, but will not be the so-called silver bullet solution. We don't have a silver bullet, we have silver buckshot, as many have said.
You suggest that tackling this problem will involve huge changes in human behavior. How have you changed your behavior?
Well, first of all, we have changed out our light bulbs and windows and dug geothermal wells and covered our roof with solar panels and switched to hybrid cars, and I'm walking the walk and not just talking the talk.
So you remember the embarrassment in 2006 when it was shown that you had a combined natural gas and electricity bill of $30,000 a year. What is it now?
Well, our natural gas bill has been virtually completely eliminated. All of our electricity then and now comes from renewable sources. So as I say, I've long since committed to this path and am proud to have done so.
Have you become a vegetarian?
No, I have not. Although for health reasons, along with climate reasons, have reduced the amount of meat in my diet. And of course, as we all know, it's much healthier to have more vegetables and fruits instead of meat. And actually, the growing meat intensity of diets around the world is a legitimate issue where climate is concerned.
And we all
Sir
should
Paul
become
McCartney
vegetarians, shouldn't we? We should all become vegetarians if we're concerned about the planet.
Well, I don't plan to. I respect those who do, but it's a personal choice and will remain so.
There is one other element in your advocacy here that people are slightly concerned about, Mr. Gore. It is this. It is that you advocate new technologies to deal with this problem of carbon emissions, while at the same time investing in those technologies yourself. The suggestion is there are really mixed motives here.
Well, I've advocated these policies for more than 30 years. And while the majority of my business activity in the last 9 years since I left public service has not been in that area, of course I invest in ways that are consistent with my values and beliefs. Were I not to, I would be criticized as a hypocrite. I'm proud to do so, and I encourage everyone to do the same.
Mr. Gore, thank you very much. I forgot to mention the name of his book. It's called Our Choice, A Plan to Solve the Climate Crisis.